Thank you for having me. I'm Tania Willard. I teach in visual art with the Faculty of Creative and Critical Studies here at UBC in Syilx territories in the Okanagan. And I am living in and from Secwépemc, which is my home Secwépemc territories, and I'm Secwépemc and mixed settler background. Because I work mainly in the field of art practice, I'm thinking a lot of times outside the box or more abstractly about some of these different ideas. And for me, so much of my learning has been grounded in both wider Indigenous scholarship, but also specific and community-based Secwépemc knowledge. And that knowledge is really tied to the land and tied to culture. And so I think a lot about ways that traditional academic practices of citing text, primarily text, don't necessarily make room for those varied kinds of models of knowledge. And so, I mean, there's some straightforward ways in terms of how I teach and working with art where we can cite an image, you know, a painting. You can cite I don't like to use the word object, but you could cite a particular part of a collection at a museum, or you could cite, you know, a video. And those practices are a bit less understood by students. And I think there's lots of opportunities to build on those, which are, you know, we have a lot of style manuals for those kinds of citations. But then in a larger kind of context, how are we thinking about the kinds of knowledges that we're bringing and who those knowledges extend from? And is an academic citation the best way to do that if the knowledge is not grounded in a Western kind of framework? So I think there's a lot for students from different backgrounds to think about. And, you know, I'm speaking about Indigenous contexts, but I think also there's contexts around language and different kind of cultural practices globally that we need to consider widely when we think about citation, as well as, you know, who has claimed a lot of the space for many years within the academic space. And so how do we bring in other kinds of knowledges in ways that can build on existing knowledge in community and held in different kinds of spaces outside the academy. So I'm always trying to go outside of spaces and think about work in those spaces and how I bridge and carry it through and perhaps you know, in some ways let it flow through myself or people I'm working with to bring those two places together. Like a bit of where it comes from, because so I'm mainly coming from an art context as well as my own specific mixed Indigenous context and Secwépemc, you know, experience, life experience. And so I'm thinking about in art practice, we have practices we refer to as site-specific or in situ art practice, which really consider not just the physical site, but it might be a history of a site, a context, a geography, a cultural meaning, and that enters into a consideration of the art that is placed there or that might be viewed there or that we engage with. So it really considers a specific kind of locale in a specific place, and sometimes we call that place-based. But then I wanted to layer that with Indigenous territorial understandings. So here in BC, we're on mostly unceded land, and those are, you know, I look back to my ancestors and the struggles they have maintained and how we struggle today for our land rights to be acknowledged. And so it was important for me to think of site specificity in ways that weren't just, or that didn't preclude thinking about Indigenous territory. And so I started to think about that and started to think about citation and a contrast with primarily knowledge in papers, academic texts, journals, and knowledge in the land and knowledge from people connected to the land. And so this idea of citation comes from thinking through site-specific art practice and Indigenous rights, Indigenous knowledge, and you know, modalities on the land, and then bring those two together. And then as I was sort of intuitively doing some of this work and in my art practice collaboratively with other artists and with my land itself, Then I also learned about Anishinaabe legal scholar John Burroughs' use of citation, and he uses a backslash, I think, and he's thinking about the ways that Indigenous story and knowledge contain a basis of governance and law. And so these are really, for me, it was interesting to see that and see the real overlap in ways of approaching and thinking, because story and language learning are also part of kind of what I look to for building knowledges in different kinds of ways. And then I choose when and where is a safe place to move between spaces of academic space and grassroots or community space. They don't always have a clear overlap. There are some important ethics to consider in those different kinds of spaces. But so yeah, and I think there's been more and more work. I see, Dr. Carrie Charnley's work. I've also been experienced with Deshinta Center for Research and Learning in Denenda with Leanne Simpson and Glenn Coulthard, and the ways that they are thinking about land as pedagogy, which Simpson has this chapter, really influential chapter, Land as Pedagogy. But it's also something we learn, I think, as Indigenous peoples when we're just a part of our life experience. And so to see that reflected, which is, earlier in my career, I thought a lot about representation and reflection. And so to see that reflected really validates the ways that our knowledge circulates. And so I needed to start to find other ways to accredit and build on legacies and contribute to those knowledges that weren't strictly academic citation practice. So that's where some of citation comes from. I think because I operate in spaces that are often outside of I do contribute to, I have some peer-reviewed articles, and I work as a curator as well, so I'm sometimes in those fields, but for me, it's really about the practice. So I think I'm thinking much more about, and I'm also often coming up with exhibition titles or artwork titles, so this citation with the backslash just spoke to a bit more of the kind of mixing of typography and ways you might depict, and also creating some space to consider those words, to consider cite, and following the kind of suffix to also think about it's close to action. So sometimes we play with it being cite action as well. And so it allows us some room to kind of play and think through that term. But yeah, I think John Burroughs used a colon actually, but anyway, so there's different ways to engage with that idea. But essentially, we're all still talking about ways that we need to have our knowledges acknowledged within the frame of how a citation citation operates. For me, it's an essential part of my art practice. I engage it in different ways through what I might do in research in the university context, but also what I might do in my just life ways and family and belonging at home. And so it very much for me straddles theory and practice and influences a lot of the ways I'm thinking and then approaching and planning and doing in my life. Actually, in a way that's quite beyond maybe other influential kinds of models that I had been familiar with before. Like it really has seeped through in everything I do, and I think continues to offer such abundance, which I also think about as being really land-based, that there is such great potential and abundance. We're often thinking through scarcity a lot of the times, also as in the arts. And so it's been important for me to think about our needs being met and then our responsibilities and acknowledging that through this kind of lens. I do operate in other kinds of ways as an artist and just as a member of my community and culture. But this play on words with citation and thinking about land-based knowledges and land as a broad concept that also includes, importantly, culture and people and community, Indigenous peoples and Indigenous territories and Indigenous communities, that concept brings together and layers together so many of these ideas. In fact, I have some of my basketry materials here today. So, this form of basketry, which has just started here, is working with cedar roots. And cedar root basketry is a common form of basketry for interior Salish people, for my nation, for Secwépemc. And it's a coiled basketry technique. And so you're actually, the practice of it is one thing. And then as I think through it, when I do it, there's also this beautiful kind of relationship of how the roots are harvested, first of all, with, relationship and reciprocity. And then we're splitting them to make them finer and finer, and then bundling them and coiling around them. And the more that you bring together, the larger and the stronger your basket becomes, and the more it can hold. So I think about this kind of metaphor and way of working that is about building and layering and binding or grouping together so that things are stronger. And I know I went off in a maybe different direction for your question, but I wanted to bring in sort of like how I think through material. So how I'm in relation to and think through material, and then it influences my making and my way of thinking, and then that becomes something that I can apply in different ways to different different spaces, including the academic space. So, I'm often in the forest digging roots, but I'm gonna bring them into this space because I think there's a lot we can all learn. And actually, that's really critical knowledge for us to learn in terms of interacting with and connecting with the lands around us, and implicating our responsibility to it, right? We're in a crisis situation in lots of ways with lands. And so it's important to broach those spaces. But yes, there always is tension with those spaces as well. And I think that that's where like being reflective, being responsive, that's really important in the work that I do, and listening to knowledge holders and to colleagues and communities of trust is how we start to build that coil, and how we start to build it up. When you're making a basket, you're making like a flat bottom first, and then you start to build up the sides. So I think it's like an apt sort of metaphor to think about how we are building, and how we need to be both maybe in the grassroots spaces, but that knowledge, where appropriate and where trusted and where valued, can help us kind of build ourselves up. So we're building the foundation, and then we can rise it up together to contain so much more. Yeah, tmixʷ, it's like a very slight difference in between Sealchtin and Secwépemc, and we say tmixw, and that is like a translation of land. But as we're talking in English about it being so much broader, tmixw, is a concept, really. It's not sort of it's not a noun in the same way as in English. It's a verb and a concept in terms of how we interact, and everything that we think and do is grounded to and connected to, and and we have different ways of interacting with. I was saying sometimes I situate different kinds of knowledges and ways I'm engaging them in different places. And as we spoke about, I use citation specifically in an academic context because it builds on and also contrasts to and holds accountable the kinds of ways we validate knowledge in academic spaces. And then bush gallery is a little closer to home. I enact that in my own home territories and on reserve. So I'm also thinking about where resources for art are, which is largely urban metropolitan centers. And we have our own ways and own practices of art, but they've suffered such suppression under many different assimilationist and Canadian systems, and continue to, that the playing field is very uneven. And so bush gallery was a way for me to ground my practice at home within my territory, within a specific Secwépemc context that was also opening up to and including broad views. So we have a tendency to think a rural space or on reserve is not sort of a global hub of ideas, but I really contest that. And in terms of art practice as well, there's so many rich Indigenous art histories and knowledges in these spaces. And so I was having opportunities to do artwork and curate exhibitions in metropolitan centers around, the nation, around Turtle Island. But it became important for me to move outside of that and to consider the space of the gallery, and that Indigenous peoples had not had the opportunity to have a lot of input into how that was operating on a systemic level across the country. And I wanted to think about, well, what could be an Indigenous framed gallery? And when I thought about that from my own experience and from my secwépemc cultural background and ethics, then it very was clearly the land itself. You know, we harvest roots to make baskets. Those are our art materials. And I work with a lot of art materials as well, but those with that in mind, then it seemed to me that a gallery actually would be not situated inside, but actually would be on the land, and that actually every time you walk out, it's a kind of a gallery, if we think of it that way, right? And we're nourished, and we find beauty, and we, you know, we contemplate, and we have a whole kind of symphony of emotions engaged when we're in outdoor spaces or responding to our environment. And so when I thought about that definition, it was very clear for me that the bush, the land, the spaces outside of prescribed kind of colonial institutions were rich spaces for me, for art practice and for collaboration and for learning. So Bush Gallery is really collaborative. It's collaborative not only with the human, but I think about also the land itself, that I need to be responsive and collaborative with that. So I think of it as a deeply collaboration-based project, and one that I continue to use in different ways throughout my art practice, that can enter in and exit from, and be sort of free of a number of other kind of constraints, because it's untethered in some ways by institutional kinds of spaces. And I like to work in both, but Bush Gallery maintains a kind of autonomy as it's outside of me. It's, you know, it's also its own thing. It's also relationships with the land, the community, my family, and other artists. It's more of a theory, viral idea. So it's definitely more than one space, and it's definitely not unique to me. It's the way Indigenous peoples operate on their lands and within the spaces that their art making and practices occupy, which is, is a broad geographic kind of consideration, both from people's home communities as well as where they might find themselves in the lands that they are visiting. And so, yeah, it's a broad concept that can be engaged in lots of different kinds of ways. But there's an important sort of set of considerations that I think about with it, and that is collaboration. Collaboration beyond thinking through just human kinds of collaboration, that those relationships are engaging the non-human, the four-legged, the winged, those that swim, all the kinds of considerations of nature and those principles. And then really importantly, you can't have Bush Gallery without considering Indigenous territory, and not Indigenous territory as an acknowledgement, but Indigenous territory as people from and engaging with. And that can be really challenging if you're in a different place, when you're uninvited as an artist to a gallery and you're not connected with the community. And so I try to embrace those challenges and address them where possible, and also recognize the shortcomings and the where I can't meet those, because I'm operating from a different kind of place. And then when I'm situated at home, it's like I'm already grounded in a way that is not always possible for me in other kinds of places. So it is something I engage in different kinds of ways. And so because of that, when I think about that way of working and that body of research, that I necessarily have to change it a bit in the academic space, and thus it becomes citation. So it becomes a way of referencing this land-based art practice and research and collaboration, but also acknowledges the spaces of the institution that I'm operating from, and then tries to build up the sides of that basket, tries to allow us to contain even broader knowledges and ideas within that. I feel like I would just change it to say Hamlet's citation. Bush Gallery, I mean, sure, there are a lot of artists interested in some of those ideas and employing them in their own work. But I think citation, because I'm employing it sort of specifically to an academic space, I think and I'm trying to both be practical about it as well as imaginative, because I think there are some practical things we can do with citing the land, citing, sometimes we don't know how to, or it's not as common to cite discussions with people, conversations, and we do a lot of visiting, right, in our communities and families where knowledge is shared. So there are some different kinds of practices of citation that we can use. And then there's also thinking really imaginatively and finding ways to work within that if you're doing a paper, but also cite something that is, that is operating in a different kind of way, citing an artist or an artwork, or thinking about the citation as a kind of a poem, or, to employ creative and interdisciplinary methods, because I think a lot of our knowledge is operating in that interdisciplinary way. So I'm hoping it allows students to think beyond just a kind of mechanical mechanical kind of arrangement of how we attribute knowledge, but actually to think through, for one, how do we want to build on those knowledges? How do we recognize them and acknowledge their influence on us? And then also be allowed to engage different kinds of knowledges and think about ways that we would, how we would either write that down or have, and note that points to a video. There's many different strategies, and I think helping open students' minds to thinking about different kinds of ways that they might attribute knowledge, as also promoting how they're engaged with it. So that's a way forward to think a little bit differently about a citation practice, and I think engage a bit more with the knowledges that we're sharing when we think a bit deeper about it. So when I think about citation, I think about some of the challenges we might face in acknowledging, family or culturally based or land-based, the way that knowledge has come to us through those systems, or for those people and relationships versus a text, then I think that there are ways to do that within the citation, but sometimes we don't think of them. So you can cite a conversation, you can cite something you've seen, but also I have a project I do where we develop a list of citations. I'm using my \ATION. And when we do this, we take a piece of paper, but we actually gather things from the land with a bit of a prompt to think through, how do we respond to or think about knowledge contained in the land around us? And people sort of gather things, and then they make their own list of citations, and it's a play on, a works cited piece of paper, but instead there might be like a line of cedar, or we've done things like squish a berry in a line, or have another plant material or some charcoal. And then people share this. And of course, inherent in all those just material kinds of arrangements and just in material itself, there are many stories and many layers and many kinds of knowledges that we bring to it. And so, we can have fun with citation as well. And I think that's important for students to know. I think it stresses us out when we're not used to the academic space, and, oh, I have to mechanically, where does the apostrophe go? Where does the comma go? How do I separate things? And those are important. And we have tools that we can use, thankfully, for some of those. But I think students can have fun with this as well. And, if something's really important to them, say there's a dance back home where they have situated a lot of their ethics of care and responsibility, then there are ways for them to cite that. They say that maybe there's a recording of it that community has that has been uploaded or something. They can cite that video. And sometimes people don't know this. They think, oh, I'm going to have to find a paper randomly that is going to say what I need it to say. And it can be hard to find that. So I think that there's ways we can point to that can have them thinking outside the box and having them have a little fun with it. The newsletters the band office publishes, or, your friend's zine, those are all published in a certain kind of way and citable as citations. And then we can think even, in fun ways about ways to cite the land. So that list of citations I explained then can become a figure, and then you can refer to that figure in your text, right? The same way we refer to an image, a picture. And so these are ways that students can start to think a bit more broadly about citation and start to have a little fun with it. We did a series of reviews, and instead of reviewing a particular text or exhibitions, which are reviewed a lot in art journals and magazines, we asked artists and writers to review an experience or an aesthetic or a relationship to the land. So it was a different kind of model of review. And those were really, really interesting and really productive. I can remember, this is a couple years ago, but Haida Weaver, Megan O'Brien, talked about an experience harvesting, I think it was cedar, but just this experience of harvesting and how there's so much knowledge when we harvest from the land. You have to know the conditions, you have to know when, what's happening with the plant or, or the different kinds of contexts of what you're harvesting. And then we have to be in relationship and perhaps offer a prayer. That might be in the language, so we might be doing Indigenous language resurgence for that. There's actually just many, many layers of knowledge within that practice. And so when we situated that review, we wanted to kind of draw on things outside of the gallery that were still aesthetic or still experiences of beauty and caring and ways that we might engage with art, but that are on the land. Yeah, a couple years ago, 2016, I think, we guest edited, myself and Peter Morin, who's also a collaborator and member of Bush Gallery. We guest edited an edition of C Magazine, which is a contemporary art magazine out of Toronto. And we had reviewers who were artists and writers actually review an experience or an aesthetic or a relationship to the land instead of just a book review or an exhibition review. We had them consider these experiences on the land, and they shared from that. Well, storymancy is a kind of a divining technique. So sometimes in art, we're allowed to get very creative and really outside the box, and we do that with ways that I'm working as an artist with Bush Gallery as a collaborative project. And so storymancy is this way of actually, and I do this in a different way with thinking about actually erasure poetry, sometimes with students. And sometimes I find an academic text can be intimidating. And so to break some of that down, which I think also has a lot of class, gender, and race kinds of things packaged into it. And so to kind of break that down and have fun with it sometimes, I'll introduce something like storymancy or erasure poetry, which is a way of arriving at meaning by sort of abstracting some of the structure and rigidity of a text. And so in storymancy, we're literally sort of using it as a divining technique. You might ask a question kind of internally to yourself or say it out loud. And then you're flipping through the book and opening it to a random page and then letting your eyes just kind of fall onto the text. And then you're reading a passage of the text. And then we infer meaning. And inferring meaning actually makes us be reflective of the question and the potential answers to it. And so I actually find it's a really interesting form of inferring meaning. And it gets us to arrive at a different understanding sometimes of texts. And the other way I do this is by taking an academic text and letting students cut it up, like a copy of it, and then they'll take the words and recompose poems based on the text. And sometimes they have tangential references, sometimes they don't, but it allows them to think through the rigidity of the form and to have fun with it and to reconstitute meaning. Because I think in the end, at least from my perspective, we are learning from and gathering from different knowledge sources, but we are mixing them and making meaning in ourselves, and that's always distinct from where it's coming from. And so it asks us to be responsible for the knowledges we carry, and also gives us a kind of way that it is making meaning for us. And so through inferring and through poetry and different kinds of contexts, as I arrive at, I hope, a way that students are relating differently to some of these. I think the other part of inferring meaning, as you mentioned, Carrie, and thinking about the ways that we're always inferring meaning in some ways to different kinds of texts, but it allows us to also have fun with it. And then I think also to have students think about authorship, that there's not only experts out there, that they carry their own meaning and their own journey, their own knowledge journey, and that they're going to bring something to it. And they have gifts and things to offer. And so it allows them to, I think, through for them to think of themselves as authors, to think of themselves as writing a text, even if it's a moment of inferring or reconstituting some words from an existing text. It gives them the power of authorship. Yeah, this idea of citation. For one, I think it's an illusion. It's something we bring to a kind of academic paper, that it's static. I mean, because it's sort of finished and published and it exists in its form ongoing. But of course, the scholar, the person who wrote it, the author, is growing and changing. Sometimes it can be hard to look back at your work, and sometimes it can be interesting because we're all changing over time, right? And we're all on a journey with each other as well. And so, yeah, I do think I make a conscious effort that comes from a bit of my art background and a bit of bush gallery kinds of ways of thinking of the way that I work with in collaboration, to actually leave things slightly unfixed so that they are moving and changing and given the space to do that. And so and we get that a lot in the art world too. We're allowed to kind of leave things up to interpretation and for people to bring their own meaning to it. And I think I carry that from the art world, and also from Indigenous knowledges, where we're asked to, we might be exposed to the teaching, but then we're asked to take that on and to allow it to become part of us and to express it in the way that the gifts that we have allowed us to express it. So when I sort of put all that together, it means that, yeah, I don't have a fixed definition of what it is, and it is a practice, and it is changing and growing, as we're having a conversation here, and as we're, building that, as we're weaving together that foundation of that basket and bringing things, to raise it and to contain and to carry and gather so much more. We have to do it so carefully, right? Like, we have to do it carefully because we want to respect where we are, the, thousands and tens of thousands, the time immemorial of people and their lands, where we might find ourselves. And we have to be conscious of when we're, operating outside of cultural protocol because we're in institutions or places that aren't responsive to the, Indigenous peoples and communities there. And so that means relationship building, right? We want to, and that can be a challenge if we don't have grounding in a place. But I also like to think of it like this, that we're all carrying pieces of our land with us, actually, like all of us, no matter where we're from. We're all carrying our, it's literally our DNA, in that we are responding to our environment over generations and populations, and that we carry that within us. And so we're sort of always carrying some part of ourselves that is related to the lands of our ancestors, wherever we go. And that can be a beautiful place to share, to acknowledge where we are, but also to share where we're from and what's important to us. Because we also don't want to be so intimidated, perhaps, that we don't share from ourselves, because we're all looking to relate to one another and to build knowledges, right? And to gather them. So I think we do it carefully when we're in other kinds of territories. And we need to go to those communities and build relationships, but then to also acknowledge what we're carrying with us and how we can use that to build relationships. I mean, in the art world, we do that in lots of different ways, right? Like, come together, do a workshop, somebody offers something from where they're from, somebody might, offer something else. Yeah, but I think building those spaces are important. So, and we actually don't have a lot of them built, right? Whether they're structures or just relationships or circles. And so, coming together with other people who have those same questions and starting to invite, and you got to start the basket somewhere. Like, look how tiny that is, right? But my basketry teacher, she has a basket that is this big. And I should say Dolores Purdyby. I should have said this at the beginning. We got distracted with many other things. But I learned basketry from Dolores Purdyby, who's an elder and basketry artist from the Secwépemc Nation. And that's important for me to acknowledge, because that's a citation. I'm citing her, not her only, but her teacher and her teacher before that, and then eventually the teacher of the land itself, in how we come to Cedar Root basketry today. So, so this what I'm doing here is the start of a citation, because it's the start of a basket, but it's more than just a mechanical kind of expression of the knowledge. It has to live in me, and I have to share it and teach it, and I have to learn from it. So it's a really responsive kind of process. I was saying we start small, right? Like maybe this is a small circle at first, but I'm constantly building it, right, and coiling it and bringing it together, and this basket can become any size I decide it's going to be. But I'm also aware when I do that I need to learn more about cyllic basketry artists, right? So it's like, when I say that here, I also realize that when I bring something like that, like this, and that I need to engage people from here as well, who will have knowledge, more knowledge, who will have protocols and ethics and care and knowledge over many generations in this field. So that's where it's like sharing, but also responsibility and relationship combined. As I do that, I need to reach out and find ways to support actually a practice that has been really suppressed. And so there's not very many basketry artists, and I'm only a learner, and that's why it's important for me to cite Dolores Purdyby, who's dedicated her life, and many Indigenous women, actually their aesthetics, their art forms are really devalued, and that continues today. So when I do a project like this, which is, around Indigenous resurgence, because it also involves language learning and learning to harvest from the land, and I do that through my work in Syilx territories. We have a long history as Secwépemc and Syilx, and we have some similar forms, but we carry responsibility. So in lots of work that I do, I think about that. And for example, with the Indigenous Art Intensive, we are often inviting Syilx artists and learning from them in very deep and meaningful ways. But like, they're really good questions, and they're like, and yeah, they're things we think about when we find ourselves at university, right? In another person's territory, and like, well, how do I relate? And sometimes we're only here for 2 years or 4 years, and it can be hard to build those relationships. But at the same time, whatever we build, we're adding to over time,